Hello and welcome to Propnx, the property podcast about all things related to the future of real estate. I'm delighted that you've joined me today. My name is Gavin Morgan, your host. If you'd like to know a little bit more about me, please check out www.propnx.com. That's propnx.com. Or drop me a line if you'd like to chat privately on gavinrmorgan@propnx.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN @propnx.com. Dr. Tim Forman, founder and partner at Undivided Ventures and senior teaching associate at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to Propnx, and thank you very much for joining us on today's podcast.
Thanks very much, Gavin, and thanks for the invitation to join you.
Absolutely. Look, Tim, it's a pleasure. And in time-honored fashion, Tim, maybe we could kick off with you just telling us just a little bit more about yourself.
Happily. So I am, as you say, a founder and partner in Undivided Ventures, which is a new venture capital firm set up to find solutions for sustainability challenges in buildings and cities. And I also wear two hats. Outside of my work in Undivided, I work at the University of Cambridge, where I teach and previously did research in engineering. And before that, I earned a PhD and a Master's of Science from Cardiff University. And that's where I studied architecture and all things related to, I suppose, sustainability and design. So I've been working in academia and in industry for about 25 years in the field of sustainability.
Yeah, and I mean, what a space to be in today, Tim. I mean, you cannot have a conversation with a real estate investor or owner without sustainability rightfully being at the top of the agenda. You and I chatted a little bit before the podcast about net zero carbon, other ways of either defining that or perhaps a better way of correctly defining it. And before I ask you about your definition of net zero carbon or how you would refer to it, it's also something that I've noticed when I speak to the owner community that the definitions seem to be inconsistent. But let's start with how you would define it or how you would refer to it, please.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There are at the moment sort of misaligned definitions, I suppose. So to some extent, I suppose we all kind of have our own, but I think that is absolutely the problem. So where we need to arrive at is a place where we have a sort of common set of definitions and a common set of parameters for measurement of carbon. Probably useful at the start to distinguish between three terms for carbon. We can talk about carbon neutrality, where we could think about that within one project, perhaps, where any emissions that are created have somehow been offset, either through carbon removals or avoided emissions, and we can talk about what that means later. That's slightly different than net zero carbon, and a lot of people would define net zero carbon to actually mean a situation where carbon emissions are reduced in line with the Paris Agreement trajectory. So that's essentially the decrease in carbon that we need to achieve to reduce to avoid the worst risks of climate change. Then the third type of carbon that I think is really important to highlight is absolute zero carbon. Not that that's a type of carbon, but it's a term for decarbonization. And when we talk about absolute zero carbon, what we mean is eliminating all carbon emissions without the use of offsets. And that's really where we need to get to, because offsets, of course, are finite. There's only so many available offsets on the planet.
And Tim, how do you think, I've talked to you previously about globally consistent definitions for all of this. And I mean, really where I'm coming from in that is in the various conversations that I have with owners and investors. I mean, in fact, some of them have determined that the best way forward for them is to define net zero carbon for themselves. because of the inconsistency in definition. And I think some of those investors will go for that definition. What was it you said? Absolute zero carbon, which I think is really what we're trying to achieve globally in its purest sense. But the net zero carbon in a lot of cases, and there are a lot of people out there that believe that offsets achieve that type of goal just as well. Do you think that's, I mean, that's presumably a challenge to a globally consistent definition? And but for me, consistency globally on something like this is important. I mean, when I look at the certifications for green buildings and the various different bodies that certify that around the world, all of which are excellent and do great work and drive the right type of development, but the lack of one standard to aim for, and particularly an evolving standard that continues to, in an appropriate and commercial way, take this forward. I mean, I think it would be very, very helpful to see that. Any prospect of seeing it, do you think? And if you do, when do you think we could have it?
I think it's there are absolutely prospects. I mean, there are various definitions that are being formed and have been formed in the last couple of years. In the UK, probably the most significant one is the set of definitions produced by the Whole Life Carbon Network, which is really a kind of a self-initiative from a mix of practitioners and experts in life cycle assessment who I think solve precisely the same problem that you're talking about. So set out to sort of define these terms for themselves. They produce great sort of one-page documents and simple summaries. The Green Building Councils, the World Green Building Council and its subsidiaries have also been working on this. I think the ideal, of course, would be to have a globally agreed set of definitions, and it seems somewhat absurd given the climate emergency that we're in that we don't have that. But be that as it may, countries and industries within countries can absolutely and should be working to agree these terms. I would say, in the OECD countries, in the so-called developed world, most countries now do have agreed terms. They may not be widely used in industry, which is probably part of the problem. So maybe some of the issue here is sort of knowledge exchange and people becoming familiar with definitions that have been maybe just recently agreed. And we're also seeing, I think part of the reason that's happening is we're seeing an increasing interest in regulating carbon in buildings, and therefore thinking about embodied carbon, and we can talk about the definition of that. But the point being that we really need to have sort of agreed standards and metrics, terminology, definitions, etc. Otherwise, it's if we can't measure, we can't manage. So it's a really futile effort to try and decarbonize.
Yeah. Look, Tim, thanks. And where I've seen important agenda items like this driven forward very well is typically when either a private sector institution or body gets a grip on it and is able to globally really move it forward. It's difficult to see how it happens across different governments. Is there a body globally at the moment that you think would be capable of doing that? Or is there still room or an opportunity or a need for that to be established?
It's a difficult question. I think, yes, there's a huge need for that. There are political, I suppose, obstacles to getting that done. And we have a difficult enough time globally agreeing on the pathway to decarbonization at the sort of International Panel of Climate Change and at the UN level. So to think about individual nations all harmonizing definitions in the next couple of years seems unlikely. That said, I think in the longer term or in the medium term, it's critical. As I say, I think for each nation or each industry to sort of self-organize at this point is probably the best way forward. That said, harmonizing or aligning with existing definitions only makes sense. I'm not here to put weight behind any one organization, but I do think the World Green Building Council is pretty well suited for that, in that they have national organizations beneath them across most of the world. So I think there's a really good opportunity there. But perhaps it's professional membership organizations or groups like the Whole Life Carbon Network that can lead the way forward.
Okay, well, thank you. And it's great to hear that you think that there are groups that have the potential to do this while it sort of moves forward in its own way in the process. I wanted to
Yeah.
come back to something that you said just a few minutes ago, and you highlighted it yourself, embodied carbon. Um, could you just tell us a little bit more about that, please, and why you think focusing on that is important?
Sure. I mean, I think for a long time now, we've been talking about energy efficiency and I suppose thinking about carbon in the context of energy. Um, and when we're talking about energy efficiency, of course, we're just really talking about the building in use. Embodied carbon captures the origin of that building, really, the raw materials, the transport of those raw materials to the point of manufacturing, the construction of the building, as well as the building in use, and ultimately its end of life. So the demolition or the deconstruction,
Uh-huh.
the disposal of the waste. All of that's captured in embodied carbon, and of course, that's equally, if not more important than what we'd call upfront carbon, or just the carbon that's used, that's produced in building the building, producing materials and building the building, or just the in-use carbon that's associated with the life, the use of the building. I suppose the difficulty in when we're confusing terms is that we're not sort of aligning and we're not talking about the same thing. Um, Looking forward, you can imagine a situation where buildings are so energy efficient that the operational carbon, the carbon that's associated with cooling it, heating it, using it, ventilating it, etc., is actually very, very small. And actually, then the proportion of carbon starts to become skewed toward embodied carbon. Um, at the moment, I think we've got a situation where both are the problem. The operational carbon, the operational energy, the energy that's required to operate buildings, is far too high to ever reach sort of global net zero. And we have this problem where the upfront carbon, the carbon that goes into a building before it's used, is also really significant. So we need to drive down both of those things at once. And let's not forget, we talk about the climate emergency, and it's easy to sort of say that glibly, but we've got 28 years to sort this problem out. And at the moment, the building sector, the construction and operation of buildings, it's accountable for over a third of our emissions, about 37, 38% of global emissions. Something in the region of 18 and a half gigatons. And I know gigatons isn't a particularly useful measurement, but that's a gigaton is a billion tons, and a billion tons is about the weight of all the mammals on Earth. So it's a staggering quantity of emissions that we're at now, and we need to get that down to zero in not much more than 25 years. So that has to happen, I suppose, through both channels, through embodied carbon and through operational carbon. And to focus solely on operational carbon, as we have done historically, is simply not going to get us anywhere close to the decarbonization goals that we have.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And I also, I think human nature unfortunately works against us a little bit here as well. People think 28 years, they think, oh, well, we'll worry about that a little bit closer to the time. This is not a worry about it closer to the time problem. I mean, if there's ever been one that needs action now, it's this. Um, Tim, something that, and perhaps maybe a little bit unrealistically, I'm very passionate about is the need to see more buildings repurposed rather than demolished and reconstructed. I think we still live in a world that loves to knock stuff down and build it when it could be repurposed. I'm in an old colonial house in the US at the moment. It was built in the 1800s. I've had loads of builders in. They all want to knock it down, but it's totally refurbable, and that's what we're going to do. I think it'll be a better house at the end of that process, as well as as well as it having been a process that's better for the environment. I'd love to see more of that thinking in the commercial sector, partly as well because I now think that technology and work practices actually support redevelopment or reimagination of existing assets rather than just knocking them down and rebuilding them. What are your views on that? And I have some view. Well, what are your views on that for a kicker? And then I'll have a few more questions that I'll tag on the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is by far and away the most important thing that we could all do is stop building and stop burning things. And in order to build things, we need to burn things. And unfortunately, with our existing buildings, we still need to burn things, which is to say, we still need to use fuel to heat or to cool or to ventilate our buildings. So the challenge really is that we have existing buildings which are very energy inefficient and therefore carbon intensive. And let's not forget about nature. I mean, we talk about the climate emergency, but the nature emergency is also something we're living with, and it's equally important. And carbon and nature are completely bound up. I mean, there's for a start, there's a sort of direct relationship between the two. Climate change is driven by the decline of nature, and climate change drives the decline of nature itself. There's also, I suppose, the point that, why save the climate if we're not saving nature? So we're seeing a dramatic decline in species in our lifetime, something in the order of 70%, I believe. And we're seeing, a real loss of natural resources and natural capital. So we've got to turn the two things around at once. I'm sorry, Gavin, I've lost track of your question, actually.
That's unfortunately I have that effect on people, Tim. But it was I was just
Actually, you're talking about nature.
no, it was about more just regeneration of existing assets and rather than knocking them down and rebuilding them, which is look, and I realize I may not be being realistic, but I feel that there could be so much more of that with how technology, etc. Yeah.
Let me pick up where I left off. So the preservation of nature is absolutely vital, and we need to be doing that as we're thinking about decarbonizing. And we need to be doing that on a similar timeline. I mean, these are both emergencies, and we have no time to spare. So anytime we're building a new building, we are producing a huge amount of concrete, we're consuming natural capital, and that's just a given. We can talk all day about ways to build new buildings with less impact, but the reality is we simply can't build our way out of this problem. We're adding about 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. We are increasingly adding floor area to our buildings. We look at global trends, and the same would be true in the US or the UK. Fewer people are living in a dwelling. So while floor area is increasing, fewer people are using that floor area. And we're using more stuff. We're buying and using more stuff. We plug in electronics when we go home. We go to the office and we do the same. I suppose the value of existing buildings is, in a sense, avoiding that upfront carbon. And that sounds obvious, but let's not forget that can be anywhere between maybe 1/3 to 2/3 of the carbon that a building would produce over its whole lifetime. The challenge, of course, is how we upgrade the energy efficiency of an existing building without depleting a bunch of natural capital and without creating a bunch of carbon emissions in the process where we don't need to. I think there are lots of other reasons, and there are cultural reasons, aesthetic reasons, lots of other reasons why we'd want to keep existing buildings. But what's really clear is there is no future scenario where we're reaching net zero with the currently available technologies that involves mass amounts of new construction. We already know that we're seeing huge rates of increase in urbanization in Africa and Asia. Just the population growth in those regions alone is really difficult to envision how we can keep within a net zero 2050. So those who can and those who have a choice should absolutely be focusing on existing buildings and maximizing the use of those assets. And you mentioned a sort of shift in how we're working and using buildings, and I think it's a really fascinating time. One of the sort of maybe unforeseen consequences of COVID was that we sort of overnight did what we thought was going to take years to do, which is transition the way that we work and the way that we use buildings. So I think it's really interesting conversations about what that means, about the opportunities that exist, about what does sort of adaptive reuse mean, and and circularity, and how do we maximize the service life and usefulness of these buildings with sort of minimal inputs.
And that's a real, I love that topic, and I think it's incredibly relevant and interesting. So I'm going to ask you right now, I'd love to have another conversation with you. I mean, not right away, but I'd love to plan a chat with you on that, because I couldn't agree with you more. We're not going to meet the targets without that type of approach. I've thought it for a long time, and I think we need to, as much as anything else, it needs to be advocated for more aggressively, when you look at the sorts of targets that we've set.
Yeah, I've heard it said that given the current rate of increase in floor area, our sector could reach something in the region of 200 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. And just as a reminder, we're currently at 18.5, and we need to get to zero. So the trajectory that we're on is literally unsustainable. We know we need to keep emissions at a point where we're at least keeping within 2 degrees, but really it's very clear now that 1.5 degree future is more than enough disruption. We are already living with a 1.1 degree increase in global temperatures, and we've seen the extreme climate events that are starting to occur as a result of that. So keeping within 1.5 degrees, which is what we need to do to give ourselves at least a 50% chance of avoiding the worst of the impacts, should absolutely be our global and national target. And that needs to filter down to individual asset managers and developers. So I think organizations need to start sort of thinking about their own carbon budget within this sort of emergency timeline. There's a lot of change that has to happen within one lifetime. It's a really remarkable time.
I mean, Tim, this is a topic that we could talk on for a long time. I mean, we're sort of we're going to need to conclude on this conversation shortly, but a lot more to be said and to be advocated for, and what I think is probably the most important topic in real estate at the moment. Anything you want to say in closing before we wrap up?
I think maybe we could talk a little bit about sort of how organizations can do this. I think we shouldn't have this conversation without mentioning and talking about the importance of behavior, of the importance of just changing the way that we use buildings, and the simple things that we could do really overnight, changing the way that we use buildings and heat and cool buildings. Simple things like putting on more clothing when we're in a cold climate, or taking clothing off when we're in a warm climate, can actually make really substantial contributions to reducing carbon. Something maybe in the order of 10% of energy demand. So that's something that requires virtually no capital investment, and can be done overnight. We also need to think really urgently about sort of immediately phasing out fossil fuels in buildings, and shifting to 100% electrification and renewable energy. And I think that's something that, again, asset managers have control over and can start doing now. The harder wins are going to come with supply chains and upstream partners and service providers, contractors, etc., people that we don't necessarily have sort of direct control over in projects. But I think there's every reason to focus now on the sort of the easy wins and the can-dos, and starting to get serious about what maybe would be appropriate carbon targets for 2025, appropriate carbon targets for 2040, and so on.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more there as well. A clear milestone plan with measurable, deliverable goals at multiple points in the way to make sure that we're actually going to complete the journey properly. I mean, Tim, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. I've massively enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much for spending the time with us on this topic. And another one soon, I hope, maybe around some of the areas that we've talked about on here.
I'd be happy to, yeah. And thanks again for the invitation to join you.
That's Dr. Tim Forman, founder and partner at Undivided Ventures and senior teaching associate at the University of Cambridge here on Propnx. Tim, thank you very much again for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So that's a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to listen today. and hope to welcome you back to hear some of our future shows. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me, look at www.propnx.com. That's PROPNX.com. Or drop me a line on gavinrmorgan@propnx.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN @propnx.com. I hope to hear from you soon, and thank you very much again for tuning in today. All the very best.